Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast. I'm Eric Rivenis. I am very excited to introduce Steven Kio to the show. He was a police officer with London's Metropolitan Police for 30 years, with over half of that time spent as a Scotland Yard detective. In his first book, called Murder Investigation Team: How Killers Are Really Caught, he writes about his personal experiences cracking real-life murder cases. His second book, which he is here to talk with us about, is called Murder Investigation Team: Jack the Ripper, a 21st century investigation. Thank you so much for joining me today. Glad you're here.
Eric, thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yes. So let me start by asking you this. What kinds of cases did you work on as a Scotland Yard detective inspector?
So when I was first there, it was terrorism. So I spent between 2002 to 2005. It was mostly almost 99% Islamic terrorism. I did that for 3 years, and I was a detective constable then. Then I got promoted to detective sergeant, and I went to work in Whitechapel, actually, in East London. And then in 2009, I went on to the murder teams, and I stayed there for the rest of my career. And I went from detective sergeant to detective inspector on there. Investigated. I can never remember exactly. I know it was over 100. I didn't keep count, but involved in over 100 murder investigations, and every type you can think of, really, in that time.
So when did you first develop an interest in the Whitechapel murders?
It's quite a new thing. So look, when I was investigating murder, I've got to be honest, the last thing I wanted to read about, watch on telly, a film, whatever, was about murder. When you've been dealing with it all day, you just want to get away from that. So I was much more likely to come home and stick on Game of Thrones or something than anything to do with true crime. But when I left the police, I've dabbled a bit in different things, because when I left, I had one goal, really, and that's what I wanted to do, is not work for anybody. I didn't want a 9-to-5 job again and have a boss. So, and the one thing that I know more about than anything else is murder, and there's only so much you can do with that legally. So I've done a few bits. I wrote the book, and I started a YouTube channel where I put up some videos around how murders are investigated, that kind of thing. And so I did some lives, and a lot of the people that come on were American, and they kept asking me about Jack the Ripper. And I've got to be honest, I didn't really know an awful lot about it. I don't think I'd even read a book. I think I might have seen a Michael Caine film or something in the past. So I thought, well, I'll research it. I need to. If this is what people want, I'll have to get my head around what the case was. So I started to dig into it, and I found it interesting. But there was one thing that just got my mind really sort of racing around it. Was the lead investigator, Frederick Aberline. And when I started to read about him and learn about his life, parallels with his career and my career were just, to me, just sort of like, well, they're uncanny. So I've just described how I investigated terrorism. Then I went to work in East London covering Whitechapel, and then went on to the murder teams. And that was exactly what he did. So he investigated terrorism. It was Fenian terrorism, Irish terrorism back then. Then he went to work in Whitechapel, and he worked there as a detective inspector. And then he went to Scotland Yard investigating murders. And it was that parallel of our careers that really got me really interested in it. So it made it a bit more personal for me, because I suddenly was thinking from his perspective and what it would be like for him. And then the natural leap was, well, what would it like being that if I was in his position and these crimes were happening now? What would I do different? What would I do the same? How would it compare? What advantages have I got now? So that's what really got me started and really interested in the case. And that's how the book came about.
So this is such an expansive case. As someone basically new to it all, how did you approach it from the perspective of an investigator?
Well, I wanted to approach it exactly that, as a police investigator. So when you investigate murders, what don't normally happen, what doesn't normally happen for you is you get your suspect first and then the crime scene and everything afterwards. It's normally the other way around. So I made a conscious effort. I didn't want anything to do with the suspects. I didn't want to go digging into any of them. I wanted to understand the crimes. I wanted to understand exactly what has happened, what crimes may be down to him, what was motivating him, what was the evidence, what did the witnesses see, what did the witnesses say. So to me, I wanted to follow the process as if I was investigating these crimes. And like I say, you don't investigate suspects first. And one of the things that was really, really important to me is that I approached it with an open mind and no biases. So when you're researching the case, it's very difficult not to absorb other people's opinions of who it may have been, what has happened, who his victims may have been. But I tried as much as I could to blank all that out, because when you're investigating, biases are your number one enemy to an investigation. If you go into any sort of criminal investigation with your mind made up about who the suspect was and etc., all you're going to do then is you're going to start looking for evidence to support your own theory already. And that is a path that too many police officers in the past have followed, and it always ends up with miscarriages of justice or the real criminals getting away with it, that kind of thing. And I didn't want to do that. So it was a real conscious effort on my part. I want to find out what the evidence is, go to the source material about what the evidence is, and understand that first. And then later on, once I've got a good understanding of the crimes, then to look at the suspects. So the suspects really did come later.
You said you were assigned to the Whitechapel district and you know it really well.
Mm.
What was it like looking at it in a completely different time period?
Yeah, so it is a different time period. They're 130 years apart, but there are so many similarities between the area now and the area back then. So East London, that area of East London has always been one of the poorer areas in London, for various reasons. It's the way it's positioned. So back in the day when it was smog and chimneys were pouring out smoke everywhere, it would flow that way. The sewage went into the Thames and it flowed that way. It was a docks area, and traditionally docks areas are poor. And it was a high area for immigration. So in 1888, the year Jack the Ripper was active, it was it was a Jewish area. So a high proportion of people coming from Eastern Europe mostly, and they were fleeing the Russian Empire and persecution there. So it was a poor area, high unemployment rate, high crime, addictions, etc. And if you fast forward to today, you've got exactly the same thing. It's one of the poorer areas in London. Just recently, it was ranked as the poorest area, most deprived. It's still got high crime rate. It's got prostitution, addiction, and high immigration. But from nowadays, it's not from Jews from Eastern Europe. It's mostly from Southern Asia. And I can't remember the figure exactly. It's something like two-thirds of the population are from Bangladesh. So it's a real high density of immigration. So in many ways it's strange, but in many ways exactly the same. I think one of the biggest differences now is that in amongst all these poor areas, these really run down and poor housing estates, you've got like Canary Wharf, which is one of our financial centres in London. You've got high-rise flats, apartments that millions of pounds to live in these, and they live in cheek to cheek in that small area. So I think that's probably the biggest difference. Is there's a lot more affluence in that area. It's not just poor, but many of the issues that, so for instance, that Frederick Aberline would have faced is exactly the same today. Problems around, I say, the drugs. Although the addiction in 1888 was more drink, nowadays it's drugs. You've got prostitution, crime, etc. So as I'm looking at what it was like back then, to me it was almost like I'm looking at it as it is today.
Wow. So there are so many opinions out there, not only on who the killer was, but which of the murders were committed by the same killer or killers. Some people stick strictly with the canonical five: Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Others are convinced Martha Tabram should be included in this group. The Thames torso murders were also happening. How did you decide which of the victims outside of the canonical five you would include in your list of victims you attribute to Jack the Ripper?
So I looked at there was a file called the Whitechapel murders, and it was 11 murders, starting with Emma Smith and finishing with Frances Cole. And so I looked at all 11 with as I say, I'm probably going to keep using this phrase, but a completely open mind. What I didn't want to do is, I know about the canonical five, and I know the five are the traditional ones that are attributed to Jack the Ripper. But for me, that didn't matter. What I wanted to do is, right, well, what does the evidence say? What can we evidentially prove, or evidentially, maybe not prove, because prove might be the wrong word, but evidentially, what is more likely to have been the case? And so that's the way I approached it. And so I looked at what the witnesses said at the time, which was really important, because obviously they were the people there. They're the ones that saw what happened. The police reports, or what exists of them, and the newspaper reports. And to me, everything else is just noise. So I've seen and I've heard people doing almost mental gymnastics to try and put across an argument and put across a theory. And that's not how detectives work. We use facts and evidence, and that's all we use. And that's what I've tried to do. I've tried to draw out the facts, draw out the evidence, and use those as a basis to one. So the way I've approached it. You've read the book, haven't you, Eric? So you know
Yes.
how I've approached it. So in the UK, this is how an investigation would happen. So the murder investigation team would go along to a murder and investigate it as normal. But in order to, if we identify a suspect that we then want to take to court and prosecute, we have to go through what's known as a Crown Prosecution Service. In the US, I'm sure it's probably similar to your district attorney sort of process. It's those people who decide whether or not the person would be charged, and charged means that you will have to stand trial. You either plead guilty or you stand trial for the crime. And the way they make the decision is a report would be made by someone like myself. I would draw on all the evidence, present it to them and say, this is what the evidence shows. This is what we believe should happen. What do you think? So that's how I've approached this. So as if I'm going to approach the Crown Prosecution Service, say, this is the evidence, this is what it shows. So these crimes we believe were committed by this person, and we would like him to be charged with them. So that's how I've approached it, by just using the evidence, just using the facts as if I was presenting it to a lawyer to make a decision. And when you do that, you have to cut out all the conjecture, or the well, this must have happened. Well, unless the evidence shows it's happened, and then it didn't. Unless a witness can come along and tell us this has happened, for all intents and purposes, it didn't. So, for instance, on one of the murders, Elizabeth Stride, what I kept coming across was, because her injuries are different to other victims, the argument I kept seeing the same argument kept put across, that the killer must have been disturbed. Well, there's no evidence for that. He may have been, I don't know. But in terms of what does the evidence show, there's no evidence to say he was disturbed. So it's those kinds of things. And when you get rid of all the surrounding, I'm going to use the word rubbish. It's not rubbish, but all the surround, and just get right down into the facts of the case, I think it makes it easier to understand what he may or may not have done, by taking away all the conjecture. And then what you end up with what I feel is a stronger argument, because this is what I believe we could prove at court, and that's the way I've approached it, rather than saying, like I say, the mental gymnastics that goes on. Well, this must have happened, and somebody must have disturbed them there, or they. I mean, you've heard it. I know, Eric. I know you've spoken to people in the past, and it's that I didn't want to get drawn into. I just wanted to stick to the facts and the evidence.
Sure. So yeah, before we start examining some of the crime scenes, as a former Scotland Yard detective, would you mind comparing the Scotland Yard of today to the one in the late 1880s?
Yeah. I mean, one of the important things to understand is that the Metropolitan Police was formed in 1829, and these crimes happened in 1888, which in relative terms isn't a long time. So it was a young organisation, and detectives even more so. I think the detectives were formed in the 1840s. I can't remember the exact date, but they'd been around for about 40 years, detectives. So they were in their infancy, really. So when these crimes came along, they'd never seen anything like it. So they really were. It was a very, very steep learning curve for them. And one of the things that police, I think, do well is they, not all the time, but most of the time, they learn and they try to learn from mistakes, especially mistakes on a large scale where it's an inquiry that people are looking at from the outside. So Scotland Yard and the murder detectives of today have got a lot of knowledge that's been built on over the years through mistakes, some good practice, but a lot of mistakes that have been made in the past. But those detectives back then didn't really have the benefit of that. And they were, what I saw through my research and writing the book was their learning. And from the very beginning, I think they were a bit out of their depth in terms of how they deal with a case like this. But very quickly they learn, and that's one of the things I really enjoyed about researching and writing the book was witnessing. And I don't want to sound patronising when I say this, but witnessing their growth as detectives and as an organisation, and understanding of what is good practice for dealing with murder scenes. So I think that's the obviously you've got the differences in terms of the technologies and stuff that's available to us today, but in terms of pure detective work, I think that's the biggest difference, is that we now have the benefit of learning from the mistakes of those that come before us, whereas they didn't really have that. They were learning from their own mistakes as they were going along.
So you write that in Victorian era investigations, police relied on witnesses, intelligence, forensics, and confessions as their primary tools of investigation, right?
Yeah, so they I mean, if you think about the process that they would have to have followed. So if a murder took place, the most important line of evidence would be a witness, that somebody saw the murder or saw part of it and could come along and go to court and explain to a court what they saw. And that's no different to today. That's exactly the same as we do now. But they were much more reliant on that. So if they didn't have a witness, where'd you go with that? They didn't have CCTV to fall back on, or forensics or anything like that. So in terms of intelligence, what was the important aspect for that was, so someone like Frederick Aberline would understand the area he policed, and if a particular crime happened with a particular MO, he would understand the kind of people that would commit those crimes. So the process would be to identify them, arrest them, probably bring them in for questioning. And in 1888, as opposed to today, a person in a police station didn't have a right to silence. They had a right to silence when they got to court, and they could, when they were charged and stand in trial, they didn't have to say anything. But at the police station, they did, and if they didn't, then that could be held against them at court, and it could go against them in terms of their guilt. So that was another very important tool. That once, if you know the sort of people that are committing the crimes, get them arrested, speak to them, and also at the same time, if they're coming out with an alibi, to chase down the alibi and try and disprove that they're telling the truth. And obviously, then you've got informants, people in the area giving them information. Beyond that, in terms of evidence, they didn't have a lot of avenues open to them. So it's not surprising that they found it harder to solve these crimes, because we're much more blessed today with other lines of inquiry we can go down to prove our case. So good old fashioned detective work was really, really important. They would have to have been very, very good at that. Whereas today, I think sometimes we can become a bit over reliant on the technologies that we've got.
That makes sense, yeah. Witness descriptions. There were a number of them, including Israel Schwartz, who made a very famous identification. He had seen someone with a woman shortly before the body of Elizabeth Stride was found at the same location. Do you trust that identification? Were witnesses more reliable, less reliable, or the same as they are today?
They're about the same. So, what a human brain is not a video recorder. When we witness an event, our brain will will retain some of the information we see, will wrongly interpret other bits, and different people have different abilities in retaining information. So when it comes to what a witness is talking about in terms of description, again, you get to take that same pinch of salt, because people do get things wrong. I've seen it so many times. Today we've got the benefit of CCTV is the best one in terms of descriptions of people that are involved in incidents. And countless times, almost every single murder I've ever investigated, a witness will say, I saw this person and they were wearing blue jeans, a red jumper and a blue baseball cap. And then you check the CCTV and they had jeans and they had a blue jumper and a red baseball cap. Or they didn't have a baseball cap, or they got the colour wrong, or they got the hair wrong, or they got the height wrong. So when it comes to descriptions from witnesses, you take that as a general idea. So what you can't do is look at the detail they've told you and take that as read. You can't say because whatever Israel Schwartz has said about the person he saw, for instance, around clothing and the hat the man was wearing, the most you can take from it really is that he was wearing a hat. When it comes to the descriptions of the hat, well, you can't take that fine detail and then compare it to another witness, for instance, the man seen with Catherine Eddowes later, and then compare the two and say, well, is the hat the same? Is the clothing the same? What you're comparing is a description retained from witnesses that either seen, and the chances are they're going to be wrong. So you can't use the detail to compare the two. And I see that happening a lot. And so just as an example, so when Elizabeth Stride was murdered, there were a lot of witnesses saw her around a pub. She was with a man that night, and there's no doubt that at least 3 witnesses saw Elizabeth with exactly the same man. And the descriptions from all 3 of those witnesses vary. And for instance, the hat he was wearing, they all describe a different hat. So the most you can take from it is he was wearing a hat. You can't say he was wearing this kind of hat or that kind of hat, because they all describe it differently. So, and that caveat goes with every single witness that I came across. You take the description, but you have to be careful with what you do with that. And what you can't do is, so for instance, you can't exclude someone completely because of a description, because that description might be wrong.
So looking at all of the witness descriptions from this case, is there a general consensus on height, build, clothing that might indicate class?
That's a good question. So I would say this is as far as I could go from the descriptions given. It was a man. He was white, and he wore dark clothing, and he was not above average height. I think that's probably as far as you go. You can't use age, because age is one of those really subjective parts of a description that sort of rely on, well, how old is the witness? If a witness is older and further away from the person that they're describing, they're probably more likely to get the age wrong. So age is a weird one, and witnesses give different ranges of ages. The clothing. Can you take anything from their class? I mean, what one of the witnesses describes it as shabby chic. It's not shabby chic, shabby gentle, which could be again. What is her class? Is she someone of a higher class than him, and we're looking down? Is it a bit shabby? It's all subjective. So, literally, I think the most you could take is he was a white man of not above average height who wore dark clothing. I think it's as far as you could go. And what he certainly wasn't doing was wearing. Well, I don't know about you, Eric, but I don't know how much you knew about Jack the Ripper before you came into it. Is the description that that you see whenever if you were to do a Google on Jack the Ripper, and you get this man in a cape with a tall hat carrying a doctor's bag. I mean, that was not what Jack the Ripper looked like. He just looked like a completely nondescript local who would probably just mingle in a crowd and he would just disappear. He was just wearing what everybody else wore at that time. And the doctor's bag one was hilarious. I had no idea about this, but so it was Elizabeth Stride's murder, which would have been the third of the canonical five. A witness by the name of Fanny Mortimer saw someone running past her house and he was carrying a black shiny bag. And the police at the time took a statement as a witness, and the police. I criticise a few things about the police in the book, and one of them is their engagement with the press or the newspapers at the time, and they didn't basically. From high up in Scotland Yard, they made the decision that they weren't going to engage with the newspapers. They would tell them the bare minimum that they could get away with. So Fanny Mortimer would come forward and said that I saw this man running past my house carrying this black shiny bag, and because the newspapers were desperate for the stories, they swamped the area looking for witnesses, speaking to people, and they obviously spoke to Fanny Mortimer, and she told them, "Oh yeah, I saw him running past, and he was carrying a black shiny bag." So that goes into the newspapers, and here's Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper is carrying a black shiny bag. In the meantime, the person that was carrying the bag has seen this and they've gone, oh, that's me. I'm not Jack the Ripper. I better go and tell the police. So he went into the police station and said that actually that was me. I was running past there and I did have a black shiny bag, and all it contained was empty cigarette boxes. But because the police refused to engage with the press, what they should have done is said, actually, the person with the black bag, we've identified them and we've eliminated them from our inquiries. So forget about the black shiny bag. But because they didn't, that then became part of the story then that they were looking for this person with this bag. But it's then since become part of folklore. And even this 130 years later, when you Google Jack the Ripper and you have a look at images, I guarantee you'll see at least one there with a black shiny bag. So, which was I write about this in the book, and I mean the police's relationship with the media and the press is a funny one. It's like you don't really want to have to engage with them, but you do, because it would help your inquiry when it comes to identifying witnesses, etc. But because they refused to, they created this myth that still perpetuates today.
Yeah. Do you think that the killer was a Whitechapel local?
As I'm going through, I'm trying to assess what I'm seeing as a detective. What am I seeing at the crime scenes? What can I glean from the information that's available to me? And the fact is a local or not. I do. It is addressed later on in the book, but you can't be definitive one way or the other. We don't know who he is. I mean, so there's one of two options. He either travelled in and used that as a. So I don't. Later on, we'll talk about the criminal profile that was done, and the criminal profiler refers to it as a fishing hole. So he comes in to that area specifically just to commit his crimes, and then leaves. Or the other option is he's tied to that area in some way, but he lives there, he works there, etc. So as I'm going through at the beginning of the crimes, I think you could lean towards potentially that he might have been a local, but the evidence is neither here nor there. We don't know, because we don't know who he is, and it's only later on it starts to build up that it possibly could be a local, and probably was a local, but we can't be certain. That's for sure.
So in your book, you examine each of the murders one by one with your modern-day detective perspective. Obviously, we're limited by time today, so could you pick maybe one of the crime scenes and walk through it with us, how it was investigated at the time, and how you used your police experience to analyze it today?
Yeah. So the first one that was dealt with... So to me, there's only one that was dealt with properly, and that was Mary Jane Kelly, and that was the 7th of the 11th. So when earlier on when I was talking about them learning, as each murder happens, you see them putting in practices and processes that they should have done from the very beginning. So the first murder was Emma Smith. But because of the circumstances of that, the police weren't made aware of that until after she had died. So you can forgive them for not dealing with that crime scene. But then the first crime scene they had to deal with was Martha Tabram. She's not considered one of the canonical 5, but she came before. She was the second of the 11, and they dealt with that in a way that was unsatisfactory, I would call it. So so essentially, what happens is the police officer that discovers it calls for a doctor, sends his colleague for a doctor. The doctor comes, looks at Martha in the stairwell of this block of apartments, and says, "Yeah, she's dead. Can we take her back to the mortuary on an ambulance?" And an ambulance back then essentially is a hand cart. So a police officer went and got a hand cart, and they took the victim back took the victim to the mortuary so that a post-mortem examination could carry out later on an autopsy. So detectives never actually saw the victim at the crime scene. By the time the detectives know about it, the crime scene is gone. So they could not do any proper detecting at the crime scene. The next one that came along was Polly, Mary Ann Nichols, slightly better in terms of what they deal with it. But the third one was so that would have been Annie Chapman, or so a third of the canonical 5, but the 5th murder. So that was one where you can really start to get in the mind of, well, what would the detectives have seen? Because the detectives would have been there, and there was an inspector that turned up, and he would have been able to do the process that we would do now, which would be to go into the crime scene and try and read it in a way where you can glean from that what may have occurred, and that could be from the position of the body, from articles that are discarded around the area, from patterns of blood, etc. So in each of these murders, what I try and do is get inside. So a process that I used to do when I was investigating murders is trying to understand what had occurred from the point of view of the people that were there. So that would be the victim and the suspect. What I learned from investigating these was that what tends to happen is things happen for a reason. People act for a reason. And if you can understand that, then you're going a long way to solving the crime. And the way I used to do that was try and get into the mind of the people there, the victim, try and get in the mind of the suspect, and then trying to understand, well, what are they thinking? What are they doing? Why are they acting in that way? Why did they do this? Why didn't they do that? And when you do that, you can try and then you get a better understanding of what has gone on. And that can lead you onto investigative avenues. So, for instance, if we were to go into the crime scene at Annie Chapman's, which happened in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, by trying to get into the process of, well, what was going on? What was the suspect thinking? What was the victim thinking? It allows you to understand the crime and how it occurred in a way that you can then think of, right, okay, so for instance, Annie Chapman went from the relative safety of the street into the enclosed corridor into a backyard. So at a time when murders have been occurring in the area. So for her to do that, if you then try and get yourself in the mindset of the victim, I'm working in a high risk job. Prostitution then and now is a high risk job. There are murders occurring in the area, but I'm going in. I'm taking myself from the relative safety of the street out into an enclosed building, into an enclosed yard. So when you start to do that, you're thinking, right, okay, well, if so I must be comfortable to do that. Now, does that mean that I know the suspect? Am I comfortable with him because I know him from the past, or is it simply that he has a charm about him that can persuade me to do that? And if he's got a charm about him, then what we're not talking about is a raving lunatic that's running around the streets in a way that's going to put somebody off wanting to go into that place with him. So when you do that and you try to understand why the victim did what she did, why the suspect did what they did, it helps you build a better picture of the crime, better picture of the suspect. And then, for instance, when you go into the yard itself and you're thinking, right, okay, trying to get an understanding of how he overpowered the victim in such a way that didn't cause alarm, that nobody heard a scream, that there were no defensive injuries on her. So how did he overcome her? How did he overpower her in that way? Then that, if you're thinking about how he overpowered her, then what you're thinking about is, well, what areas of her body did he touch? So when we examine a victim for forensics, you can't examine them all at once. And the way we do it is we take swabs, so like a cotton bud that you use for your ears, like a large one of them. You're wiping on a part of the body, and it's that swab that scientists are examining. So from a body, you could have 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 swabs, depending on the circumstance of the murder. So by trying to understand what has gone on in the yard and how the suspect may have overpowered her, that allows you then to target which swabs you're going to look at first, because it takes quite a long time to extract a DNA profile, if they exist, from a swab. You're talking a couple of days. So if you've got 50 swabs, by the time you get to the 50th one, it could have been 100 days or so. And obviously, you want to identify a killer as soon as possible. You want to get him arrested to get the evidence from him, and also you want to stop him committing any more murders. So it's really important that you focus in on the work that you do around forensics, and then if you're understanding what's gone on in the backyard and where he's gone through, what areas within the yard is he more likely to have touched? Are we going to get more success by targeting this area with our swabbing than this area over here? So it's a really important process of getting into a crime scene, and the way I describe it is, if you're a detective, you have to be able to see and not look. Anybody can walk into that backyard and have a look around, but that's not seeing. Seeing is understanding what it is you're looking at. A stray bit of blood here. Well, why is the blood there? A piece of personal property of the victim over here. Well, why is it over there? That kind of thing, and understanding that really does help you prioritize exactly what you need to do in that crime scene. Because I say you can't do everything. And it might be something that you look at really innocuous, but by looking at it through the eyes of the suspect or the victim, something may jump out of you. Actually, that's actually really relevant. And if I hadn't had that thought process, I would have missed it. That makes sense.
Yeah. So evidence. As you studied account after account of these Whitechapel murders, were there moments when you kind of scratched your head? Why didn't they collect this piece of evidence? What did they botch? And if you were going to step back into time with your training as a detective, what would you have done differently?
So my biggest criticism of the detectives then was photography. Now, what we understand today is the importance of photographing a scene, photographing a body. If you see a blood stain, photographing a blood stain. If there's a murder weapon. The whole point of a criminal investigation is so at some point down the line, you will go to court, you will have a trial at court, and the men and women on the jury are able to make a decision on this person's guilt. In order to do that, you have to bring that crime scene and everything that's in it and everything that you've seen to court. And the only way you can do that is by a photograph. And I know it's a cliche that a picture paints 1,000 words. But if you take 20 photographs of a scene to a court, that's far beyond you could ever describe it, and it's very subjective what you choose to say or not say, or what importance you place. So trying to get an understanding of the crime scenes is actually quite difficult, because you're doing it on the basis of people's descriptions and what they've remembered to write down, etc. So that was my biggest criticism of them at the beginning of the murder, because it's not like photography was something new to them. They didn't have fingerprints. Fingerprints came in the UK around, I think, in 1902, something like that, 1901, 1902. So they couldn't avail themselves of fingerprints. So yeah, there's no criticism there. But photography had been around for decades, and that's one of the things I can't understand, is why it took them so long to understand that taking photographs of a crime scene. And it may be that something within those photographs later on becomes really relevant to help them solve the crime. So that's my biggest criticism. And because of a lack of Early on, they didn't even draw plans. They didn't even draw a sketch of the crime scene. So it's very difficult. If you ask the question, what did they miss? It's really difficult because we don't know really what was there. Annie Chapman's murder was a bit better because the inspector that was there at the time did make detailed notes. But again, he didn't draw. We haven't got a picture. I think he may have done a plan, but we haven't seen it. Certainly didn't take photographs. So and then you said, how would it be solved today? So actually, one of the things. So when people talk about what would be the difference between 1888 and today, there's one thing that people outside of the police don't ever consider, and it's a very, very simple thing. It's not sexy, but it's something that would have made a huge difference to them back then than to us today. And it's a computer. And it may sound like a computer. So they generated. I know I've criticised them over the photographs and whatnot, but they did a tremendous amount of work. I mean, mind-blowing amount of police work went on in 1888. So, for instance, after a couple of the murders, they got some leaflets, the appeal leaflets, printed up to hand out to people asking for information and to contact police, and they printed up 80,000 of these. Now, on our investigations, we might do 2,000. On a larger investigation, we might do a few thousand, maybe up to 10,000 even. But 80,000 is a huge amount of leaflets that were going out. And they were all going out to different houses. And they would have been generating information from local residents and potential witnesses, etc. And they had no real way of properly collating and cross-referencing the information that was coming in. It would have been huge. It would have been colossal. And to put that into perspective, so they were a young organisation who would have been hit by this huge amount of information that they would have to have not only store but cross-reference. So if one witness over there is saying one thing, and another witness over here is saying something, and actually, in actual fact, what they're talking about the same person or they're talking about the same bit of information, they had no way. It would have been a lucky coincidence that the same officer might have been reading the same bit of information. And to put that into perspective, so that was 1888. We had another Ripper in the UK, the Yorkshire Ripper, who was in the 1970s, and he was allowed to carry on killing for years, largely because the police then had so much information, so many bits of statements, documents, people ringing in, etc., and they had no way of cross-referencing it. And the Yorkshire Ripper got stopped 9 times by police and spoken to. But there was no joined-up thinking because there might have been a piece of paper over here with that information, but the piece of paper over there, the same person didn't read it. And there was a piece of paper in the police documents that's of a friend of the Yorkshire Ripper saying, Peter Sutcliffe, I think it's him. And they had that piece of paper with him. But because they had no way of cross-referencing everything, and that was nearly 100 years after 1888. And since then, because of that and the fallout from the Yorkshire Ripper, a computer system's been introduced that now allows us to cross-reference everything. And it may not be the sexiest answer in the world when you think of DNA and geographic profiling, criminal profiling, all this stuff that we've got. But in actual fact, the amount of information that they had back then, if they had this computer system that we've got now called it's called a Holmes, it's Home Office Large Major Inquiry System. If they had that back then, there's a really good chance that the information they held within their paperwork would suddenly have started to become clearer. And, for instance, a name might have kept cropping up, or a bit of information about somebody over here who could be matched up with the information over there. And within that, suddenly, it all becomes clear, and they've identified Jack the Ripper. But they didn't have that luxury. So when people talk about the differences between then and now, I know our minds go to the things like DNA, etc. But something as simple as a computer system that could collate all this information would have been a huge help to them.
Yeah. So as these crimes, these events unfolded through this autumn of terror, would there have been a moment along the way where someone, a patrolman, a detective, had they been better trained, might have picked up on an important clue, might have been more observant, and could possibly have stopped more of these murders from happening? I know this is pretty speculative, but Was there a moment when you thought, whoa, if only this had happened, perhaps the murders might have ended?
So there's a principle in modern day criminal investigations. It's called the golden hour. And what this is the time, it's not an hour, but it's the time just after a murder has occurred is the most important critical time of any murder investigation. It's the time when at a crime scene, evidence is going to be most abundantly available. It's the time where you need to get it right. And a lot of our training that we have goes into that. It goes into that golden hour, and we get taught systems and we get taught ways in order to deal with a crime scene at the beginning. Because the problem with criminal investigations, if you get it wrong at the beginning, it makes it very difficult to then solve the crime because you're always on the back foot. You've missed something. You haven't done something properly. And what I see from what I can glean from the police reports and everything, witness statements, etc., is they were very poor at that initial investigation. And I'm not saying that if they'd got that right, they definitely would have caught the killer or identified him, but they would have given themselves a much better chance. Today, if we don't get that part right, we might as well forget. You might stumble across and get lucky solving a crime, but if you don't get that initial part right, and I think it's that is one aspect that. And ironically, by the very last murder, they started to get it right, but then he stopped for whatever reason, possibly. I mean, there's debate that he carried on, but the last of the canonical five is when they actually started to get things right, and it was too late by then. But that it would be one aspect from a murder investigator's point of view. Looking at what they were doing and what they were getting wrong, that's one of the most important, because we put so much emphasis on it now and we understand the importance of it. Because they weren't doing that straight away, as I say, they were on the back foot and they were making it more difficult for themselves. In terms of catching him, in all honesty, I think they drafted in from across London so many police officers, so many they would be in plain clothes, in uniform. One of the aspects that I think they really struggled with, which didn't help and did hinder them, is when earlier on at the beginning I was talking about confirmation bias, and it's when you've already made your mind up and you're looking for information to prove yourself right rather than prove the truth. And as I'm reading the papers and everything that's coming from the police, they were hung up on this person being, in their words, a lunatic. They couldn't comprehend why a person or how a person could commit these crimes. What would make them do it? Why would they want to do it? And one of the biggest problems I think they had in their investigation was a failure to understand serial killers, because they'd never dealt with them before. It's understandable that they couldn't get their head around it, and they couldn't understand what motivates a person to want to not only kill but to mutilate a person and to remove parts of their body, etc. And what that did was, because the person doing this can't have been normal in their minds. It can't have been a normal person. It must have been a lunatic. So they ended up spending so much time looking in lunatic asylums and looking for people completely out of the ordinary. So, for instance, it was a travelling cowboy show that they investigated. Greek gypsies, all these, some lunatic students, and there's all these things that they were getting caught up on because they couldn't comprehend that somebody normal, I'm doing bunny ears, you can't see that, somebody normal would go out and commit such heinous acts. But we know better. We know that if you're going to catch a serial killer, the chances are there'll be somebody that nobody would ever have thought of. They're not these loner loonies that people would point out. Well, actually, yeah, we always knew this, but he was probably out killing people. They're just normal members of society. Some of them in high positions in society, and it's that lack of awareness around who the killer may have been and the type of person he may have been that distracted them to a point where they could easily. I mean, if I write about this in the book, where I'm in no doubt whatsoever. I've got almost zero doubt, as zero as I can get to it, that the name of Jack the Ripper was in the police paperwork, because they spoke to so many people in Whitechapel, so many thousands of people, had so many bits of information coming in. I'm in no doubt whatsoever that his name was in there. If we think back to the Yorkshire Ripper, where he'd been stopped 9 times or whatever, in my experience in the police, whenever I've been involved in any large inquiries where it's been going on for a long time and we're trying to find a suspect, when we do find him or her, it's normally him, the chances are, what you do is you're holding your nose when we go through his computer system and you put their name in, he's going to be in there, isn't he? And 9 times out of 10 he is, because if an inquiry is that big and it's spoken to that many people in that area of that type and connect those connections, the chances are that person's going to be in there. And I've no doubt that Jack the Ripper would have been spoken to by officers at the time. But if you're looking for a lunatic or somebody who's completely not normal, well, how are you going to identify Jack the Ripper if he is literally just a local man that everybody knows and everyone thinks is a nice chap? Well, it can't be him because he's not running around the streets with drool coming out of his mouth. So I think that's another aspect of, if I could go back in time, it would be, look, you need to understand the kind of person you're looking for. It isn't a lunatic. It's almost certainly not a lunatic. It's somebody, if we go back to Annie Chapman, had the charm to be able to persuade her to go from the relative safety of the street into this backyard. That's not somebody who's running around like a nutter. That's somebody who can hold a conversation at the very least and can persuade somebody to go and do something with them. And I think that aspect definitely didn't help them.
You said that investigators had gotten much better over the course of these murders, and by the time Mary Jane Kelly was slain, they were taking crime scene photos. Were there other things that police were doing correctly with the Mary Jane Kelly investigation that maybe they were lax on with Polly Nichols, for instance?
Yeah, so I turn up as a murder detective at a murder. There's certain steps I will go through in order to make sure that I'm talking about the golden hour and the evidence that we're going to secure. So, for instance, so we use 5 steps, and the first one is preservation of life. Mary Jane Kelly, there's nothing you could have done; she was dead. Then we got preservation of scene, and that is when you're locking down a house or you're putting cordon tape up around an area. You're closing that crime scene so that we can then later on come in and get evidence from it. And what they didn't tend to do in these murders is properly do that. They were very, very quickly before. I mean, within minutes of a doctor coming along, and the process was a doctor needed to come along. The terminology is pronouncing life extinct. It's a terminology we still use today, and they used it back then. Yeah, you need a doctor to come along and say, yes, this person's dead, even when it's patently obvious because they've got their innards outside. It takes a doctor to say that. And then once the doctor said that, they said, right, take them back to the morgue, and I'll do my examination later. What they did with Mary Jane Kelly was completely different. Well, they preserved the scene, so she stayed there. Her body wasn't taken away, so that later on we could come at the police, detectives, and the doctors could come along and properly assess the scene, properly understand what has gone on, take photographs of her, take photographs of the room. So that step is what they did. So they preserved the scene. Then it's securing of evidence is the next step we go through, and that's speaking to witnesses, getting hold of any exhibits, a murder weapon or any discarded items of clothing, etc., around the scene. They did that. Then they looked at bloodstains, and they interpreted from bloodstains on the wall, because there was what looks like potentially arterial spurting, and she had her throat cut on the wall. What they interpreted from that is that she was closer to the wall when she was killed, and then her body was moved. So blood pattern analysis wasn't around then. That came along later on in the 20th century. But this was a very early form of it, of them interpreting the crime scene from the bloodstains. And everything they were doing resembles what we do now. They put police officers on the front of the house. They made all the they made the residents leave the area. So all the things that I would expect to see and do a murder scene today, they were doing that at Mary Jane Kelly's, and they weren't doing that at Martha Tabram. So you see the progression of learning. It's little bits at a time. They're adding. By their very end, and I describe it as Mary Jane Kelly's investigation as Scotland Yard's entry into modern day detective work, because it's like the first time I saw signs of what we do today then. And it was really pleasing for me to see, because I've got skin in the game. I've employed by the Metropolitan Police for 30 years. I don't want to sit there and dig about that they didn't do their job properly. I want to be able to see that, and to be able to see the progression and the learning in a relatively short space of time. I found it really heartening.
What are your observations of the crime scene photographs? Are there new clues to be found in those photos?
Yeah, it's really difficult because they're not particularly good quality. So you couldn't make any detail out. Say, I was talking about blood pattern analysis. So I'm not a forensic scientist, so I couldn't do this. But if we had photographs that were clear enough to see the blood staining, they would be able to, through BPA, make an interpretation of. For instance, you've got different types of blood staining. So cast off is if someone's where he was stabbing her, for instance, as he pulled the knife up. Cast off blood tends to shoot up a wall on the ceiling, etc. Then you've got arterial spurting, which can go in like a zigzag as the heart's still pumping. The blood sort of goes into a zigzag. Contact stains, where if there was blood on his hand as he smeared it. So if there was a good enough photograph of a blood stain, you might be able to start interpreting the scene there. But from the photograph of Mary Jane Kelly, it's very difficult to say. I mean, I think the very most you could say is the ferocity of violence that was used. Beyond that, you can't really interpret it anymore, I don't think.
The mutilations are one of those continued areas of interest many people have with this case. How did period detectives interpret those mutilations, and have those interpretations changed with forensic advancements? So
I go back to their lack of understanding about what motivates a killer. So obviously you've read my book, and I've got my own theory on what motivates people to kill. And to me, there are three reasons. If you strip back what motivates a person to kill, it comes down to three reasons. And it's the same three reasons we do anything in life. As human beings, we're motivated to act by three things. It's what we feel, what we want to feel, or the benefit we're going to get from it. And that goes for murder. It goes for any activity we choose to do. If you think of exercise, why do people exercise? It's because of what they're feeling inside, what they want to feel, or the benefit they're going to get from it. And it's the same with murder. So when we talk about things like revenge, jealousy, anger, disrespect, they're feelings that I feel. Because of the way I feel, I go on to kill someone. The gain is the gain you're going to get is like robbery or terrorism or something. By killing somebody, I'm going to get a benefit from it. The motivation that they didn't understand, and the one they couldn't get their head around, was because of how I want to feel. Now, unless you understand that, when you look at these crime scenes from those detectives' point of view, that what is driving this person? Why are they killing a person and then mutilating them? And what they didn't understand is that's an inner drive. It's an inner need. It's that I have to feel something. And I talk about in the book about it becomes semantics when you start talking about, is it power? Is it control? Is it sexual gratification? Is it enjoyment? You can get caught up in trying to label it, but essentially what it is, it's somebody, they're doing it because of what they need to feel someone. They're being driven by what they want to feel or need to feel inside of them. So that today we understand that, and that's why when I'm looking at those photographs and I'm seeing those mutilations to Mary Jane Kelly on a dead person who's committing these, I understand why he's doing it. I know he's doing it because of how it makes him feel as he's stripping her skin, how it makes him feel as he's mutilating her face, how it makes him feel as he's removing her breasts, how it makes him feel. It's all about him and what he's feeling inside. And that's the benefit we have now, years and years and years later, from understanding what motivates killers. So psychologists and people may describe it in different ways, and they may use different words to describe it, but it's an inner drive within the killer. That's what's going on.
Okay. The letters we are all familiar with, the Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, the letter from hell. How would police today treat those letters? Are they important at all to solving the case? Would tracking them back to their source help at all?
Yeah, so there's three kind of main ways of doing it. Well, two forensically and one different. So the obvious one is fingerprints and DNA. If a letter, the envelope that came in, has been handled by the killer, we'd be looking to target for fingerprints and DNA. With the envelope itself, so that's probably going to be more difficult because you don't know how many hands it's passed through. But the letter itself will probably give you a better chance if it's been handled. Although, let's be honest, people nowadays, they know about fingerprints and DNA, so they're probably masking that. So we'd be targeting the letter for itself. And obviously the stamp. Some people do lick stamps and put them on. Criminals do it. Not every criminal is a mastermind. So we'll be targeting that. So fingerprints and DNA around the letter, the envelope, and the stamp. And nowadays we've got something called question document examination, and it covers various aspects. That's like a scientific branch, QDE, and they look at letters in various ways. So, for instance, the handwriting. So if you identify a suspect and you can get a sample of their handwriting, you can compare the two, and they'll be looking for sizing of letters, spacing, the slant of letters, etc., things like that. But obviously that can prove difficult if the person is trying to mask their writing. So they might write with the opposite hand. They may use capital letters instead of script. They may change the pen, change the pressure, whatever. They may try and mask their writing. Then you've got so the indentations on the letter itself. So we can look for if it's on a notepad, we can look to see whether there's any writing that was on top of it or under it. Those kinds of things. So there are methods that we can try and identify the letter from, none of which was available to them back then. So they had a really difficult task. All they had was a stamp. And in the UK, I'm sure it's the same everywhere else. When a letter gets posted, goes through the post office, and they put a stamp on as to where the letter was posted. And so they would have had a general idea of where it come from. Nothing beyond that. Then if they'd got a suspect, potentially they could have got the letters compared to handwriting. But the overriding thing in all this is none of these letters we know came from the killer. So I know Patricia Cornwell has written a book, and she places a lot. Well, she says it's Walter Sickert, and she places a lot of emphasis on the fact that his DNA is on some letters that were written. But we don't know that the killer wrote the letters, and that's the biggest hurdle to get over. Even if we had DNA or fingerprints or whatever method to identify who sent the letter, all we're proving is that they sent a letter or handled the letter. What we aren't proving is the person that sent the letter is the killer. So to me, they're two different things. And if we were investigating that today, you would investigate the letter as if it had come from the killer, but you wouldn't take it as a fact, because you can't say that. And why I've dealt with that in the book is I'm not putting my opinion on it, because I think we haven't got enough information. I haven't been able to look at the different letters and the different writing and the different circumstances in which they were delivered, etc., to even say that the letters are by the same person, let alone be able to say that they're the killer.
So would you explain what the BIA is and its Jack the Ripper assessment and how it compares with your assessment?
So in the UK, criminal profiling is quite tightly regulated. In the past, it wasn't so much, and it resulted in mixed responses from the police. So they were getting advice from people whose qualifications were debatable, put it that way. So what happened? There was a particular case in the UK where it all went a little bit wrong as a result of some criminal profile advice. And it got taken over by what is called the National Crime Agency. And it's kind of similar to the FBI in the UK. It's a national agency who have responsibility for certain crimes. So they took over responsibility for providing police with criminal profiles. And so what they don't call them criminal profilers. They're known as behavioural investigative advisors. Same thing. It's just semantics, I suppose, at the end of the day. But they provide criminal profiles for the UK police, and there's only 3 of them in the country that can do it. So every police force in the UK, when it comes to murders or serious serial sex offenders, they will go to one of these 3 people. And I'm very, very privileged, and I feel humbled that one of them agreed to do a profile for me on Jack the Ripper. In life, you don't ask, you don't get. So I approached her and I said, "Pippa, would you mind providing me with a profile on Jack the Ripper?" And it sort of piqued her interest, because I suppose if you are into that kind of field, I don't suppose there's anybody more famous that you could do a profile on. Certainly someone that hasn't been caught. So she agreed to do it. And what they do is they provide, it's really in 2 parts. So the first part is known as a crime scene assessment. And that is them looking at the crimes themselves, the scene, the behaviour of the victim, the behaviour of the suspect, and trying to ascertain from that what they can. Trying to build a picture of what has gone on, why has it happened, what was motivating the suspect. So very similar to actually what I would do and what detectives do anyway. So when we go into a crime scene, we're trying to read a crime scene. We're trying to look for clues as to what's gone on and why it's happened, who's done it, etc. So very similar to that. So throughout the whole of the book, I essentially do what she's done at each crime. I do my own crime scene assessment by trying to do that, trying to understand what's gone on from the clues that have been left behind, from what the witnesses say, etc. So she does that, and to be honest, when I did it, I'd already done all of my crime scene assessments, and I'd made the decision, whatever Pippa come up with, even if she went against what I said, I would go with it. I'd publish it, because when you investigate murders, not everybody agrees. If there's a team of you investigating a murder, you could have various different views about what's gone on, who's done it, etc. So I took the decision, whatever Pippa came up with, it would go into the book, and if it was different, it was different, and that's just the way things are. But it just happened that she very much mirrored what I said, which from my perspective was nice, because you got someone as experienced as her justifying, ratifying your work, if you like. That was good. A bit of a relief, if I'm honest, because as much as I would have gone with it if it was different, it's much nicer knowing that she agreed. But the second part is where what she does is completely different to what I can do, and that's the predictive profile is called, and that's what you would associate with what we think you would get from a criminal profile, and that's trying to understand the type of person that would have carried out this crime. And she does that using two areas, really. One is her experience, because she's been doing this for a long time and she's dealt with a lot of murders, serial murders, serious sexual assaults, that kind of crime. So she's got that to fall back on. But there's also a lot of academic study that she looks at, looking at previous murders, previous similar types of murder. So it's important, not just murders, but similar types of murders. So for us, we're looking at attacks on females at night outside. So that's the kind of previous crimes that she's looking at. So not just any old murders, ones that closely resemble what we're looking at. And to me, this is what I found really fascinating, because I can't comment on the type of person a killer is likely to be. I could hazard a guess, but it probably wouldn't be any better guess than most people, because I can understand why somebody commits a crime and I can catch them. But what I don't know is what person that is likely to be in terms of their age, their marital status, their employment history, their criminal history. So that's what she does, and she's built up a picture of the characteristics that he's most likely to be. So, for instance, age. He's most likely to be in his late 20s and in his 30s. So what that does practically is, as an investigator, if you're investigating something like Jack the Ripper, you're going to end up with many suspects. It could be dozens, it could be hundreds of potential suspects, and as much as you would throw resources at trying to catch him, they're finite. You can't just put exactly the same amount of effort into investigating every single person on that list. You have to prioritize somehow. So that's where her predictive profile would become really helpful for an investigation. Because, for instance, if we're saying he's more likely to be in his late 20s and his 30s, you can prioritize people of that age on the list. That doesn't mean you would exclude others. It would mean that you would just look at the ones within that age range first. And also, as well, for instance, she's of the opinion that he would have very close ties to the Whitechapel area, rather than being someone who comes from the outside in. And what she describes it as a fishing hole, she says is much more likely in sort of a 90% type likely, so really more likely than not to have close ties to Whitechapel, which again allows you to look at suspects and prioritise them. If someone's on a list and they've got no obvious ties to Whitechapel, then you would look at them afterwards. So for me, it was a fascinating piece of work that she did. And if I were investigating these murders in real life, I'm convinced that her findings would greatly assist in us identifying the killer.
That makes sense, yeah. So as you've said, there are so many suspects. A couple of my past guests, Donald Rumbelow and Tom Westcott, don't think the case has been solved and don't have a suspect they commit to. And you really don't commit to a suspect either. What are your feelings on the myriad of suspects surrounding this case? Charles Lechmere is really popular right now. Francis Tumblety, Montague Druitt are a handful that we've covered on this show. Tumblety was an outsider, so he doesn't really fit the profile, your friend's profile. Any thoughts on any specific suspect you might, if not commit to, at least eliminate?
Yeah, so my answer to every single suspect that you could name would probably be exactly the same, in that as a process I've gone through looking at these crimes, if I was to ever say, right, I think this person is a suspect, for me it could only be done on evidence, because that's what I've lived my police career doing, looking for evidence, relying on that. And if I'm looking to get a person convicted of a crime, it would be based on the evidence. So when you look at the actual evidence in these crimes, it's actually very little that you can actually pin your hat on and say, this can help us identify the killer. What essentially it boils down to really more is some descriptions given by various witnesses that they're not specific. They're quite generic. They could fit most people in that area at that time. So the actual evidence that comes from the crimes, from the witnesses, from the crime scenes, in terms of linking him to a suspect, I struggle to see how you could do it to a level that would satisfy you of this person's guilt. What people do quite often is they will come up with reasons why somebody is a suspect, and they're very, very circumstantial. They're never this person was seen at the scene of the crime. Maybe Lechmere obviously was at the scene of one of the crimes, but in terms of generally, you're not going to be able to say that person was at or near the scene of a crime. You're not going to be able to say they fit a description, because you could probably say that to half the people in London at the time. They don't fit. They're not specific enough to the descriptions to pin to anybody. So in terms of positively placing a person as Jack the Ripper, I think we really, really struggle. So, and it's for that reason that for me, Donald Rumbelow, Tom Westcott, probably all come to the same conclusion, in that without that evidence, it's impossible, I think, at the moment, to say such and such is a suspect. Now, what I've done in the book is try to come at a different way, in that with these suspects and the ones you've named are there, rather than proving that they are Jack the Ripper, which I think we're struggling with and we will continue to struggle with, come at it the other way and try and eliminate them. Is there what we call elimination criteria to positively say, well, it can't have been them that was Jack the Ripper? So that's where I've come at in the book. And I'll be honest, it's not a... If I were to do this properly in terms of eliminate everybody that's ever been named, it would need a book of its own. And there's far too much already in there to lose myself in that, in the 100, 200, 300 names, or whatever it was, and try and eliminate them all. So I've just gone for the favourites, if you like, the top 10. And I've come up with elimination criteria. Now, in terms of the profile, that's a difficult one to use to eliminate people, because what you would do with the profiles, as I explained before, is that you'd use it to prioritise when you look at somebody, whether they're an immediate priority or they're down the list somewhere. So I think it's dangerous to eliminate people just on the basis of that. So, for instance, interestingly, which I didn't appreciate, according to past crimes of this type, the offenders are more likely to be married than single. Now, in my mind, you always sort of, for me, I sort of conjure up like a bit of a loner committing these crimes. But in actual fact, from the small sample they've got, he's more likely to be married. But what you couldn't do is then eliminate people that weren't married, because one, it's a small sample size, and two, it's most of them, it's not all of them. So it's dangerous to eliminate people on the basis of a predictive profile. So I've gone for things like if they weren't in the area at the time. If you can positively say, well, they weren't in Whitechapel. So, for instance, Tumblety during one of the murders was in America. So you can eliminate him. And so there's a few of them that you can do. And by doing that process, I come down to 2 suspects. And one of them, if in a slim chance that Jack the Ripper happens to be one of those 2, I favour one over the other. I won't name them, because that's for the book, and I don't want to spoil it for the people that are reading the book. But that's as far as I could go, really. I can eliminate people from a list, but the overriding thing has to be Jack the Ripper has to be on that list, and I'm not convinced that he is on that list.
Makes sense, yeah. Well, gosh, this has been so interesting to see this from your perspective. So you mentioned you had a YouTube channel. Yeah, and the YouTube channel, to be honest, I don't even use it anymore. The videos are up. I don't add to it. It was okay. It was a phase in my life. I don't do it anymore. Oh, okay. And you have a website? Yeah, murderacademy.com. I'll include the link in the show notes. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today to offer your insight on this very infamous case. That's not a problem at all. Again, I have been speaking to Stephen Kio. He is the author of Murder Investigation Team, Jack the Ripper, a 21st century investigation. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.